Okay, we are live. Greetings, everyone joining in. Good afternoon, and greetings to everybody else joining in from the rest of the world. Baselining normal with resident cyber criminals. How do we catch the persistent criminal, and how do we deal with the criminal after we discover something? A very exciting debate and discussion. There are not going to be too many slides. A couple of pointers to everybody listening in now. And for those listening in after the recorded session is available, there are several attachments you can download, links, etc., that you can download after the webinar. We recommend you listen in first. And please do leave feedback. You can also use the question feature to ask any questions or raise your hand, as they say, if you have any particular questions. Obviously, if there is a fire, if there's a hazard, save yourself. You can always come back and listen in. But some very interesting discussions happening today on how do you deal with the criminal that doesn't go away. It's a very important concept here. We're not talking about the average cyber criminal. We are talking about the criminal that is persistent in your network and that is actually going to cause you more damage and harm the longer you leave the criminal in the network. Okay, a little bit about, I'll let the speakers introduce themselves first. Anthony, I'll start with you. Take a minute and introduce who you are, a little bit of your tech background, and what Cynet does.
Yeah, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Anthony Roberts. I work for Cynet. My background, I've been in IT for coming up to 20 years now. The last 15 years, I've mainly been working in security, mostly on the vendor side, working for some of the larger corporate security vendors like Symantec, Trend Micro. Also worked for service integrators as well. What I do now is, as it says here, I'm the UK sales engineer and the UK technical lead for Cynet. I was the first employee from a technical perspective in the UK at Cynet. Cynet as a solution is an endpoint breach protection solution. So we were the first autonomous breach protection solution to market. So what we're doing is we're providing visibility of the endpoint environment across servers, desktops, laptops, multiple operating systems across multiple infrastructures, from cloud, private, public, as I mentioned, virtual, physical. What we're doing is, so it's visibility, it's detection and auto remediation.
Excellent. Anthony, thank you. And we'll come back to exactly how Cynet works with and solving this problem. Burak, a pleasure to again speak to you again today. Please introduce yourself and what does Lookout do?
Hi, Amar. Yeah, thanks very much for having us on your session again today. Yeah, my name is Burak. I'm an enterprise sales engineer here at a company called Lookout. Lookout is a big data cybersecurity company focusing on delivering protection for iOS and Android devices in company fleets and for BYOD strategies as well. I come from a long history, well over 25 years spent in IT. The last decade and a half spent as a pre-sales engineer working for endpoint security vendors, including the traditional desktop endpoint management solution companies, moving into VDI about 6-7 years ago. And then very recently, as we've seen the emergence of these two platforms in the corporate context, I've been very attracted to the threats and the landscape that we see for these two devices that we use today, and how we might go about understanding the threats that are prevalent for iOS and Android, and what we might want to do in order to mitigate the issues resulting from the external pressures on these two platforms today.
Excellent, Burak. That's a good one. Thank you. And for those of you who think iOS is 100% secure, please rethink that statement again. Yes, the other platform is more insecure. but we'll leave that discussion for a different day. But iOS is not necessarily at all there is no 100% secure system, folks. Brief about me, very briefly, before we dive straight in, and as the numbers start to go up of the audience. The Blue Turban, that's what I'm normally known as. Amar is my name, and I'm the CEO of a company called Cyber Management Alliance. We do a lot of cyber incident and crisis management advisory, and we also actually do a lot of, and I understand the technologies, hence being invited to talk to Burak and Anthony on discussing how their solution and their solutions actually help in this particular problem. And in terms of crisis management, the biggest headache in crisis management, folks, is persistence, which is what we were going back to the original title. How do you catch? How do you detect? We're not only talking about prevention, okay? And Burak and Anthony, we're going to assume that the attacker has somehow made it in, right? And I think for those of you who don't know, I will set the scene. A good criminal is going to make it in and become permanently resident. And what we want to start to understand is, how does one organization go about even acknowledging and start to discover the reminiscence hints that something is wrong? Burak, actually, Anthony, if you don't mind, Anthony, I'll start with you a little. How does an organization go about what do they need to look out for?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you for the question. I think it's obviously a massive challenge gaining visibility into these persistent threats. I think to be able to do this, you have to somehow gain complete visibility of your environment. Obviously, it goes without saying you have to have the right processes, the right people, and a good plan in place, first of all. I think we're seeing, obviously, over the years, we've had this breach protection pain whereby, from a traditional perspective, we will implement lots of technology to try and gain visibility and identify some of these more persistent threats. But it becomes very complex and difficult to manage. So I think, first of all, it's key to try and find a way to gain visibility of all of your infrastructure. And I think it's really key to make sure that you gain complete visibility into your endpoint environment, because it's my belief, or from what we see, is the endpoint is becoming a new boundary. We don't have this nice core physical infrastructure anymore where we can put a nice security boundary around our infrastructure like we did in back in the day, like IPSs and firewalls. The endpoint is more dynamic. It's accessing more cloud applications, business applications that are in the cloud. We need to somehow, I think, provide more visibility into the endpoint to try and identify what normal looks like from resident cyber criminals.
Excellent. And I mean, Anthony, you said it, but Burak, I think you agree also. And let there be no doubt, given where we are today because of the pandemic, I don't want to say anything else. The reality is the endpoint, the mobile, is the perimeter, right? It's the biggest and single group set of devices that are going to cause an organization extreme pain. Using your particular, you mentioned Lookout. How do you guys go around handling this issue of a criminal trying to gain persistence?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I would align with everything that Anthony says. I think the biggest pivot required from a security standpoint today is that we are now actively living in a post-perimeter world, which is to say, very near past, everybody has been outside the perimeter in terms of their working day. Mm-hmm. And so with that, then the whole challenge as to where the persistent threat comes from requires an important pivot from a security standpoint. It's no longer network centric, but much more about having an understanding and full visibility into a spectrum of risks on a mobile device, which is to say, how is this threat meeting with the device in the first instance, even before we speak about persistence. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, that model has very much changed, and organizations have been painfully slow to adapt to the agility of the threat actors today, who have for a very long time cited these two platforms, iOS and Android, as being a very rich source of content, not least the corporate data, but also the personal information that's hosted on there. So, double win for the threat actor that gets access to these types of devices. So it's important to have a big body of information that you can mine in order to understand the evolution of threats, which then helps you and aids and abets, obviously, finding the threat that has been engaged in exploits or in deploying threats for a long time. And our solution really helps with that. And any solution that's based on big data today will be very important.
So, Burak, I'm going to stick with you, and then Anthony, I'll come to you after this, because it's interesting, right? This momentum is good. So, big data, mobile, how do you marry that? Because where is the logging happening? So let's dive a little bit more into this and get kind of some value, more value for the folks listening in. How is Lookout actually doing this? Because everyone agrees mobile endpoint, like Cynet is doing, is a big vector, is massively important. With mobile, there's the maybe additional complication of personal data and corporate data. But how are you doing this big data analysis? What is happening?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And ultimately, the first thing to understand is that access to a mobile device and getting telemetry and information is very different to how we've conducted that business on the traditional Windows platform. And that's to say more and more as we move forward, Apple and Google are kicking vendors out of the kernel, right? And the reason for that is so that we can maintain up-to-date operating systems, which requires us to access the app stores and download updates, which means that effectively the operating system can't be hooked. So Apple and Google have learned a lot to secure the operating system. Not least, sandboxing is something that we hear a lot of objections to as we talk about providing protection. Well, the sandboxing infrastructure implemented by Google and Apple is prone to compromise, just like anything else that's software based. So what I'm pointing at is that over a very long period of time, what we've had to do is we've had to amass device and application telemetry from these two platforms, so that moving forward, we have today, a decade and a half's worth of iOS and Android telemetry, which is to say we've had, over 180 million people register their personal device with Lookout's personal application. It's a free app. And with that, we've had the technology and the smarts in our application to be able to grab the apps that are installed on a user's device without ever affecting their PII. So we can take in-app purchases as an example, but what we then do is analyze those applications through a number of back-end services, so that what you end up with is authoritative information about what is an anomalous operating system. So if we have 180 million iOS and Android devices, we know a badly formed operating system when we see one, and with a very high rate of authority and conviction, we can indict that device as being jailbroken or rooted or compromised in some way. And then by analyzing the apps, we break those applications down and analyze the code so that we can then track the evolution of the threats over time and then continue to provide protection on an ongoing basis to those threats out there as they remain persistent on the device by way of the user either installing an app that contains that threat, or by that threat then spawning to various different applications or different infrastructures. And so what we're saying is look at the apps, look at the device, make sure you understand the network, but also be aware that you're clicking on stuff several times a day, and you need to have something that mitigates the issues there as well.
Excellent. So if I may quickly summarize, what you're saying is Lookout it has a lot of telemetry. It's built up, telemetry that it's built up over the years, and you're leveraging that threat intelligence to then kind of preempt anything that you see as possibly malicious and mapping it against what you already have.
Yes. I mean, a threat actor is not going to reinvent an access Trojan or an advanced mobile persistent threat, that MAPT, those will be those parts of the malicious code will be reused from other threats that have been seen out there. It's very rare, or it's going to be very challenging for the threat actor to have to completely rewrite from new a remote access Trojan or a threat. And so having that data set means that we can continue to track that threat.
Excellent. And we all know from experience, criminals are lazy in a good way, I guess I dare say so, that why reinvent the wheel? They use what's out there. Excellent. Anthony, if I may come to you now, and sticking with the same theme, you gave a brief introduction of what CyNet does, but what are you seeing in terms of how does your particular product, in terms of the help me as a buyer looking at this solution, or at this problem rather, of the resident criminal? How does CyNet, are there any specific things that make me go, "Ooh, okay, this is what it does"? Can you share some of that, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's probably worth understanding CyNet's background a little bit. So CyNet came from an incident response background. So it's very, very important, as I mentioned before, the first thing we offer and we do is to give our customers complete visibility of their endpoint environment. Obviously, not covering what Lookout does and the mobile devices. We very much would want to look to integrate with a solution like Lookout to share that analytics and that big data, bring the two platforms together. But it's very, very important, first of all, for us to gain visibility across the endpoint environment. We want to make sure customers have complete visibility of all of their desktop laptops across multiple operating systems, going all the way back to legacy operating systems as well. Because to gain that visibility, you can then start gaining insight into the environment. Inventory listings, inventory management, what's installed on the assets, how are users using those assets, those endpoints, what are users doing, what users are logging on, what files are being run, what certificates have been installed, etc., etc. First of all, it's very key to gain that visibility. That helps provide the data, because we're monitoring in real time, and all the data is sent back to a centralized database, with which then your customer security teams can then search that data and run searches, forensic searches across their environment for certain indicators of compromise. But the second thing, and what I think is very important these days, is having the ability to detect when persistent threats are happening, and also potentially remediate against them in real time. Because I think there's a massive challenge, obviously, around skill sets in cybersecurity and time to be able to investigate and respond to attacks. So
sorry to interrupt you, Anthony. You mentioned so this is quite interesting, right, for the audience listening in.
Yeah.
You mentioned CyNet comes from an incident response background.
Yes.
How are you leveraging that knowledge or that experience in CyNet? Am I making sense in my question?
Yeah, well, obviously, when CyNet was created, it was from a bunch of entrepreneurs that all came from offensive security backgrounds, and in their previous employments had been working in red teams, had also been part of other exciting startup companies, and very much worked on the offending side of security. So they used, obviously, their knowledge to then create a tool which would very much counteract offensive security and be on the defensive side, using techniques within the product that can identify, sophisticated attacks such as living off the land techniques.
So can you briefly spend a minute? What is living off the land, so that everyone knows?
I mean, it's very easy now for attackers. Burak mentioned before about, obviously, a lot of threat actors, it's very easy for them to script and create new malware off existing malware families. But what it's also very easy for them to do is to use legitimate tools within your environment. So especially within this current situation we're in at the moment, we're seeing it more and more be used, especially through phishing campaigns, whereby, you'll have an email, it'll have a URL, the URL will run a script which will then call on a legitimate process on the operating system, like PowerShell, for example. So it's all fireless, using a legitimate tool to run a script which will then escalate privileges on the endpoint. Very, very difficult to detect that sort of behavior without having the right sort of behavioral analytics in place across the endpoint.
Excellent. If I may summarize this, folks listening in, basically this is fileless attack and living off the land, I guess, as it says on the tin, living off what you have. And if you're a Windows user, you may have PowerShell, for example. And what we are saying is that the advanced attackers, remember, residency, persistence is the game of many advanced attackers. The longer they stay hidden, the better. And sorry, Anthony, you were going to say, but that's what you are rightly identifying is without installing any application. The question you have to ask for those listening in: can you detect an attempt to become permanent if nobody installs a software?
Yes, that's definitely correct. And to give an example of some of the ones we've seen recently, TrickBot was one recently that we wrote a report on, and what it initially did to make itself persistent was interact and integrate with Windows Test Scheduler. So it had run a scheduled task every 9 minutes, I believe, to try and run the TrickBot malware. And what it did then was if it was successful, it would open up a command line. Again, Windows Task Manager, command line, all legitimate tools to Windows. Very, very difficult to identify this behavior. And what TrickBot actually did through command line was disable the local Windows Defender. But this is one example of persistency and how they're persistent within the environment. Very, very difficult to
very useful, very useful information. Burak, if I may come to you, sir. Given, as you know, it's mobile everything now. I mean, my nephew, 2 years old, first thing he gets up in the morning, he wants his mobile. Given everything being mobile and the complete complexity in the Android space, if I may, how are you keeping up with the telemetry? Because we all agree that the kind of mobile device is the place to compromise, right? In addition to what Cynet is doing, but in your case, how are you keeping up with the complexity of the systems, the OS? With organizations, do they have to share all of this information? Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's over 9,000 different variants of Android out there today. So a huge challenge for Google, if no one else. And over the last couple of years, we've seen Google effectively pull its OEM support, so that it's basically trying to flatten Android, and it's introduced some quite compelling enterprise features into its solution stack, if you like, going so far as even going into the MDM space today as they move forward. Keeping up with it for us is a matter of having a freemium application today and a large enterprise customer base today that's grown very rapidly over the last 3 years, as you rightly state, as we move to our first world. So being that we have a device corpus of in excess of 180 million mobile devices, that gives us quite enviable reach across the Android operating system version. So we'll have seen one of everything effectively, based upon being deployed in well over 150 countries worldwide. So places you're not going on holiday is what I always joke.
Yeah, I mean, these days no one is going on holiday anywhere, but hey, yeah. Yeah, sad reality, but no, and that's very useful. And I guess the question is, sorry, I want to. You said earlier 9,000 variants.
That's correct. Yeah.
Of Android alone.
Yeah, that's right. So these will be manufacturer-specific versions of Android. There'll be institutional versions and repros designed for specific use cases that may be supported by SIs and the like, and the large providers who may be offering a fully managed service may build in certain features into a distro of Android. So we'll see a wide variety of those, but ultimately what the attacker is attempting to do, having socially engineered and having pushed a payload or installed malware or phished credentials, is that on a mobile, you're trying to elevate privilege.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, the thing that Apple and Google learned is you take away the context of a local system admin to your device, and you significantly harden the machine model. So the point is that, you know, our IOCs are designed to detect changes to the core operating system that elevate privilege, if you like. And when that happens, that's a catastrophic failure of the security infrastructure on the mobile device. So we recognize that, and at that point, you know, regardless of the version you've got, if you like, we're going to detect that indicator of compromise and alert accordingly.
So if I may stick with you before I go to Anthony, Burak, in Lookout's experience, in terms of the telemetry they have seen, what is the kind of most interesting or most worrying attack? Anthony mentioned TrickBot, I think. Do you have anything that you can maybe share a little on any particular platform?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a huge uptick in the number of threats meeting with mobile. And again, as I said earlier, it's because we're seeing the threat actors certainly pivot to these two platforms, especially under the conditions that we're in. So we've seen a great number of COVID-19 applications designed to exfiltrate data. What more worryingly, in the context of this particular discussion and panel, as we talk about persistent threats, for a long time, Lookout's been at the forefront of a discovery of a nation-state funded threat by a company called NSO Group, who have made hundreds of millions of dollars supporting governments writing surveillanceware. You know, ultimately, you have to realize we're all walking around with a surveillance device, highly capable surveillance device in our pockets.
Correct. Always, almost 23 hours a day, I guess.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. And first and last thing you put down and pick up in terms of your technology every single day, always did high-def camera, high-def mic. And certainly just looking as a simple example at WhatsApp, for instance, we estimate that around well over 40% of users of WhatsApp today have a compromised version of
Sorry, I need to interrupt you. 40% of WhatsApp users are using a compromised version.
What I would say, let me rephrase it. It's a vulnerable version. So
vulnerable version.
Yeah. So the underlying code of that application has been open to compromise, has been exploited, and as a result of having a particular edition of WhatsApp, it is possible for governments that are employing NSO Group's Pegasus or Cryosor software to push that to your device, and you'd never know anything about it. There's no app icon. There's no payload. And in terms of persistence, the functionality to be able to turn on any one of the 70 or 80 features of your phone is based on a command and a C2 service, a command and control structure. So in essence, if you've met with Pegasus or Cryosor, that malicious, capability can be turned on at will by whoever's decided that you're a target.
So basically, you are okay. Very good, very good knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a question, but we'll come to that a bit later. Okay. Here's a question, and Anthony, I'll go to you first. In your experience, in terms of the persistence element, and Burak, after that you. But first, Anthony, how do you baseline bad? Does that make sense?
Yes. It does.
Yeah. So briefly for the listener, what that means is if someone's already in your network, and you are now trying to baseline it and consider it normal, how do you stop doing that? How do you stop yourself from doing that?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I've worked with a lot of network threat analytical solutions, which kind of the way they work, they would take a network feed and run some AI to baseline what good looks like, and then obviously outside of good, is identifying those anomalies, those user anomalies. I think it's very, very difficult to do in today's dynamic environment. As I said before, with the endpoint being so dynamic now, accessing multiple infrastructures, not even having to be connected to the network, it's very, very difficult to baseline normal behavior. And I guess that's why me personally, I chose the decision to go and work for a security solution that moves away from trying to baseline, because it, as I've mentioned, it's very, very difficult to do that with more and more customers from who I talk to, moving to public cloud infrastructure.
That's very interesting. So basically, Cynet's position is no baseline.
We use AI in a way that we're not doing it in a way to baseline a normal user's environment, because it's very difficult, especially when you take into consideration what we talked about before, living off the land attacks. They're using legitimate tools that an administrator may use on a day-to-day basis. Even a normal standard user on an endpoint doesn't know that some of these processes run in the background, but it's just a normal process calling these processes, or a legitimate application calling these processes. So in my experience, trying to baseline an environment can generate lots of false positives. And if you haven't got the right team, the right processes to manage that data and that information you're getting from the baseline, then it becomes very difficult. So we do it in a slightly different way. If I can just touch on it quickly, the way we do baseline it is, because we're on the endpoint already, we're collecting all of this information about running files, users, domains that are being accessed, URLs, processes, etc., etc. We're not baselining that. What we're doing is we're collecting all of that and making it available as one of the options to run forensics and search the environment. But the second thing you can do is you can enable rules to query the data that's in the database to try and identify, something other than normal behavior from an end user. So has the user logged in at the weekend, for example? Has the user accessed an application for the first time? So we can flag that sort of information out, not by baselining, but by querying data we've already collected.
Okay, very interesting. Burak, if I may come to you. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I do apologize. Sorry, there was a bit of an echo. Yeah, so Burak, how do you, in terms of Lookout, you've got all this telemetry, but are you baselining? What if an app is already, considered good, but then it changes a little? How are you managing this threat? Because surely it's something that you are seeing yourself, isn't it?
Yeah, and the challenge is far more acute when you're talking about mobile. I mean, 208 billion downloads from the Apple and Google app stores last year represents a pretty profound shift in the way that we access the apps that we use, through which our enterprise data flows. So it's a much more difficult challenge to set baselines, and I would align with Anthony. I certainly, ideally, post perimeter, it's really about identification of the issues real time at the moment that they happen and providing protections for those. So much in the same way as that you'd set up rules, at Lookout, we have protections that are effectively a signal into a customer's tool set for doing what you're saying, which is baselining. And I would do that with my inventory management tool or my mobile device management tool to set an iOS or an Android policy that meets with my corporate security requirements and procedures and standards, right? What I'm saying is that out there in the big bad world, there are a number of issues. And from a baseline perspective, I would be saying to my valued customers, look at the device, make sure that you realize that the moment that a new operating system comes out, within hours, it is likely that the firmware will have been compromised, and the ability to have elevate privilege can happen. And so you really want to be focusing on keeping things bang up to date from a mobile perspective. Look at the apps and put in place a protection that says, if I see a vulnerable version of an app, then prompt the user to update that app. It might be very challenging from an organizational perspective to impose your will to want to remove or block WhatsApp. But in the real world, that's the tool set we all use in our corporate and personal lives. So much better to enforce the user to stay, clean and healthy by making sure their applications bang up to date, that their operating systems bang up to date, and then have technology that is assessing the reputation and, the validity of the network connection that I'm making from that device. And then, if I might, just one final point, what we saw through last year was, from a mobile perspective, a massive increase in the rate at which users are falling for phishing attacks on mobile. And that stands to reason based upon the form factor, the number of interactions a day. We see a huge return on that rate. And so something that protects the user from clicking on a malicious link in whatever that activity is can only be a good thing as a first line of defense.
Excellent. And a quick question, I think that's been in my mind, and a lot of our clients also ask us about this. And we absolutely love the concept of threat intelligence. Anthony, I'll come to you after Burak, you first. So can your product ingest existing threat intel? Am I making sense in my question?
Yeah, I mean, we effectively, like any good security company, are backed together with our big data analytics and smarts in the cloud. We're backed by a world-class research team. And those researchers come from all good places that you would expect, focused on iOS and Android, over and above, the automated, machine learning, AI, whatever you want to call it today, that humans are matching that effort in their discovery and capability. You just can't get around, humans and their ability to make discoveries that are really critical in making sure that customers are protected on an ongoing basis. So, yeah, we are very much backed by a big research team.
Excellent. Anthony, can Cynet ingest external threat intel?
I don't want to go with the de facto response here, but I'm going to have to. That we do have we do have a REST API, so obviously everything's possible. It is something that I get asked a lot from a lot of customers, and it's something that we're definitely working towards and considering at the moment. If there's a use case, then obviously we would look at that use case, and it's very easy to write it into the API.
No, I guess the angle I'm coming from, and Burak, this is also for you, but the angle I'm coming from is, say I've discovered something. Large companies are paying commercial threat intel providers a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
$100,000, $200,000 a year sometimes, or even more. Now, and that threat intel says, "Ooh, watch out for this threat actor about to launch an attack." Now, how do I get that information into one, Anthony, you can take it quickly, and then Burak will be you. Do I phone you up? Do I integrate it with you straight away? Anthony, you first. Go.
Yeah. So there's a few ways you can, because obviously Cynet's coming from the automation perspective, so we want to try and automate everything. So if we can, we want to be able to take a feed from an existing threat intelligence platform, feed it into our solution, and then monitor for those IOCs, for example. So potentially we could do it that way. And then the other way is you can obviously add IOCs that you know of or hear about into our solution to then do active threat hunts for those IOCs as well.
Excellent. Burak, what would a client do? Or someone?
Yeah, good question. And I kind of come from a research basis because we're pretty much the authority on mobile threat intelligence today. So our threat event API is outbound into a customer's SIEM solution to notify that solution in the event of an incident. In terms of inbound, our PCP service, which is our phishing and content protection feature today, through our agent on the endpoint, will be allowing a user to submit a URL, either where that's an FP or a site that they want to provide to us. So that's possible. There's no direct ingestion pipeline for us for customer telemetry per se from a technology standpoint, but certainly our threat advisory service allows customers direct contact with one of our researchers, and that customer then gets very focused threat intelligence reporting and a link into our organization.
Very good. So they can, okay. So here's a question. And this is especially is coming out for Lookout because of the mobile element. I'm sure you've been asked it before, but how, say an organization rolls out your product, how, and as you know, as you also said, many people are using the mobile for personal and professional. How is Lookout segregating, or is it even touching any personal information? Am I making sense with that question?
Yeah, you are. So and it's always good to make sure that we're differentiating between iOS and Android at this point. So
okay, go on.
As we mentioned, that Android Enterprise offers enterprise features that allow companies to deploy Android devices with a corporate and a personal context. So where the customer has a mobile device management solution, we can leverage that to deploy the application seamlessly to both sides of the container. There is always going to be user interaction involved on the personal side, but certainly on the latest iterations of Android for enterprise, if you like, and managed application configurations means that that's a silent effort on the corporate side. For iOS, there's always an element of user interaction that's involved.
Right.
But in all cases, all Lookout wants to know is the operating system okay? Are the apps okay? Is the network connection okay? And we do all of that without ever impeding on users' personally identifiable information.
Okay, that's actually very insightful. A question, another one that's come in, and Burak, you first, and then Anthony. In your context, in your product context, what is the dwell time, if that makes sense? And it may not be relevant, but it's a question. What is the dwell time you are seeing criminals before they get caught or discovered, rather? Does that make sense, Burak?
Yeah, it really does depend on what vector we're talking about. So, again, I've talked about the device, the applications, the network.
The application, I guess.
Well, from an application perspective, it will again depend on the malware that we're talking about. If it's Trojans, bots, chargeware, adware, there's a whole variety of classifications that we provide out of the box for detection of those issues within applications. Generally speaking, the app vendors, if you take WhatsApp as an example, last year, CV3568 from last year points to an issue in the VoIP stack for WhatsApp, which meant that, again, Pegasus could be pushed to that version, via that version of that app to the device. Facebook, that was patched within like 24 hours, retrospectively, by the vendor. But the challenge is that delta, right? And then the mitigative action that companies need to take to patch that hole. And so when we talk about dwell time, we actually have that concept in our console today. So against each of the threats that a device might have met, you'll actually see a timer there that we call dwell time that shows how long that issue has persisted for on that device and therefore in the environment. And I think that's the relevance, is making sure you have a signal that is establishing that there is a threat on the platform or in your estate, and ensuring that in a timely manner that's dealt with, either automated or by way of a user engagement. We need to minimize that dwell time there. So we'll always talk to having a cloud-first approach where we're uncovering those threats and then providing that intelligence, and by way of the smarts on the device, we're then detecting and then throwing that signal to an MDM or to the user to do something. So
excellent. That's a very good answer. And I like the concept of the dwell time per user, I think you mentioned on your dashboard.
Yeah, and I think I may make a final point on that. I think it's very important, again, that we do differentiate between the different attack vectors. So for PCP, for instance, a threat actor can today with one click set up a phishing site where one-click phishing kits are available. I can get free compute, free SSL certificate, and I can be posting, a malicious site within a matter of hours and then be gone within 24 hours. So that takes another, set of technologies in order to make sure that our users are safe. So it really depends what we're talking about, but certainly it's about having the intelligence and having some security services on the endpoint to detect these issues, because we don't have the perimeter.
Excellent. And just 1 second on PCP, that's your phishing something product, you said.
That's right. Yeah. So it's a method by which, without backhauling all of the user's data to an inspection point, you can on the device detect the addresses that the user's trying to get to by way of clicking in emails, SMS, web pages, but moreover the back-end connections that apps are making today as well.
Excellent. I'm going to come to you, Anthony. A quick one. A reminder to everyone listening in, do download all the collateral that you can. Also, if you use this particular... Oh, it's not... Okay, the slides aren't working anymore. They've gone back to the same slides. But there was a code there which you can see, go back and see, C to C10 if you get the CIPR training. Anthony, what is the dwell time you are seeing? And how
it's a very good question, and I'm very much aligned with what Burak said as well. It's very difficult to answer. Obviously, there's lots of different threat actors and lots of different channels in ways in which they can exploit the endpoint and then be persistent and stay a lot longer within the environment. If you look at the average dwell time, it's still very, very high, and I believe the reason for that is because there's lots of a lot of organizations don't have the processes and the right people in place. So it's one of the reasons why SINET was developed and created, was to help identify threats very, very quickly and remediate instantly. And to be able to do that, I think, as Burak mentioned, you need to have the right technology at the endpoint across your traditional laptops, desktops, but also your mobile devices as well. So from a SINET perspective, we use multiple technologies in a single agent across the endpoint. So we have network analytics, we have full-blown EDR capability, deception capability, user behavior analytics, machine learning, AI. We fuse all this together to identify different threat actors and then detect and remediate instantly to reduce that dwell time. Okay,
Anthony, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. One, briefly, because sadly we are running out of time and we can always go on for very long. What is the deception, element of yours? Can you explain that very briefly?
Yeah, sure. So there's 3 elements to our deception. The first one is we can plant deception files across the endpoint environment. So we can you can upload or use our default ones, but you can deploy decoy files.
Excellent.
If there's someone persistent that grabs these decoy files and they touch them, then you would get an alert and potentially you can then respond to it.
Excellent.
We also have deception users. So we can create deception users. If a threat actor tries to escalate privileges to a deception user, we'll flag on that. And we have deception network. So we publish fake hosts on the network, and hopefully a persistent threat actor will try and move to one of these deception hosts, and we can gain visibility of it.
Excellent. I really like that idea. Well done. Okay, and a quick one. SINET has an offer. Do you want to quickly mention that?
At the moment, yes, we do. We have an offer which we're saying for any new SINET customer, what we're doing is we're saying that you can have 6 months free of charge, full protection for any of your users that are having to work from home on private devices. We will also cover those private devices as well. Included with that is a fully managed detection and response service, which is part of our security services team. And you'll also get 3 free professional services to get the solution up and running, which I should mention is all SaaS based.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. Yes, very exciting. I really like your deception offering. That is a very interesting trick. Okay, folks, sadly we are running out of time. Anthony, not longer than 1 minute. Your final thoughts, and then Burak, you'll be the closing one.
Yeah, no, I guess first of all, thank you for the invite to the session. It's been really interesting, and I think it's been a great topic to discuss. My final thoughts are, persistent threats are a huge issue. I really believe that you've really got to start looking at the endpoint again across mobiles and your laptop servers. You've got to try and gain that visibility into what's happening across the endpoint and where those endpoints are connecting to. I think that's really key in tightening up your security posture.
Excellent. Burak, over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I would focus again on these 4 key attack vectors that I've tried to highlight today for mobile. Not just looking at mobile threats and persistent threats from a network perspective, but making sure you're thinking about what applications are being used in the environment. Are my devices all up to date? And what is it? And what are the dangers of users being able to click freely within all of the different attack surfaces on a mobile device, be that email, SMSs, web pages, or the apps themselves today? That we need to be thinking about it more holistically. And again, I'd just like to thank you, Amar, for inviting us again. It's been a pleasure, Anthony. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you.
Everyone, before we go, want to thank Burak and Anthony. My closing statements on this is, it's not just about network persistence, as you say, Burak. It's not just about it's the fileless, as Anthony was saying. It's about deception. It's about actually figuring out the apps and protecting every angle. It's not just the laptop, it's the mobile. It's not just the mobile, it's the laptop. So you got to look at it from every possible angle. And you really need to rely not on just technology, but the people behind the technology. Everyone, thank you for the time, and do come back and listen in again. Burak and Anthony, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.